The main engine of America's auto industry is in danger of stalling out. General Motors lost nearly $31 billion last year.
Now, how did a company that at some point owned more than half of the United States automotive market fall into a brutal bankruptcy in 2009, losing all of its market share and all of its customers? This is the story of GM. Now, the story of GM starts with William Durand, who founded the company in 1908 together with Charles Mould and Frederick Smith. Now, between 1908 and 1910, they acquired 13 car companies and 10 parts makers. However, this also meant that the company was financially overstretched. And because this had a lot to do with the way William Durand handled the business, he was pushed out. However, he started Chevrolet, which was then acquired in 1916 by GM. Now, William's dream was to create a holding with a car for every segment. Whereas Ford, on the other hand, focused on one car for all. In the late 1910s, GM acquired United Motor Holdings, which was a component and accessory automotive holding. Now, with that came Alfred P. Sloan, whose company was acquired earlier by United Motor Holdings. He became vice president and later president in 1923, and in 1937 he became chairman of the board, where he stayed until 1956. Now, Alfred is the main person who is credited with GM's success. When he resigned in 1956, GM held a market share of 50% of the US auto market. He is also credited with creating styling changes every year, thereby introducing the concept of planned obsolescence. He also introduced a pricing structure with his so-called ladder of success. It looked like this. It was Chevy, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. And the beauty about this ladder of success was the fact that these car brands did not compete with each other, but merely complemented each other. He and his companions also created the GM Acceptance Corporation, which basically allowed financing instead of saving for a car, which is the financial structure we use to this day. Now, all of these innovative changes and these market adjustments, together with the fact that Ford was being reluctant to change, let GM dominate for quite an extensive period of time. Now, it wasn't always sunshines and rainbows for GM. For example, one of the main problems they had at that point in time were unions. Unions were quite strong against automotive makers such as Ford and GM. However, where Ford resorted to downright violence and setting up fake unions and trying everything in their power to make sure that the unions wouldn't get to the Ford factory, GM gave up quite quickly. Now, GM was dealing with the same union, which was called the United Auto Workers of America Union, and they got hit with quite a few strikes. One of these strikes, the first one, was at the Fisher plant in Michigan Flint in 1937 in January. This, just like the strikes that had happened at Ford, definitely also was a violent strike with GM literally fighting back. In February, the union did the same thing at the Flint Chevy plant, which was the point where GM decided to give up. They signed a contract with the United Auto Workers. Now, the United Auto Workers actually gained quite a lot when they signed this contract. One of these things was hourly minimum wage, the setup of grievance committees, seniority policies, and they abolished piecework pays. And also, of course, they gained a unified voice. However, the Second World War quickly came around, which is quite a dark page in GM's history. Instead of doing what was morally right, GM produced weapons for both the Allies, GM in the USA and Vauxhall in Britain, and the Nazis, because they also owned the Opel brand in Germany. One of the reasons for this was that Alfred Sloan quite admired Hitler, and a Nazi chief even stated in 1977 that Hitler would have never considered invading Poland without the synthetic fuel technology provided by GM. At the end of the war, GM was compensated with $32 million by the US government because its German factories were bombed by US forces.
No other mark of identification speaks so clearly of the product that bears it as does the famous Cadillac V and Crest.
Now, skip forward a few years and we're in the 50s, 60s and the early 70s, which was a booming period for GM and the American economy as a whole. However, a lot of people say that GM's bankruptcy started in the early 2000s with their mismanagement and their terrible acquisitions, which we'll get into later. However, I would argue that their financial troubles actually started in 1973 with the onset of the gas crisis. In 1974, its sales were down 35.7% year over year. Subsequently, GM failed to produce smaller cars quickly enough, and this gave way to fuel-efficient Mazdas, Volkswagens and even Audis to take their share of the market. Now, the problem with GM was the fact that instead of engineering cars that were focused on fuel efficiency and making sure they were smaller, they were focused on return on capital, because GM's motto has and will always be the fact that profit comes first. Now, in the 1980s, GM had severe competition from other brands, such as the ones from Asia and Europe, and they were paying so much to retirees that some people said it was more of a healthcare company that was selling cars for a loss on the side. By 1990, they only owned 33% of the US market. Also in 1980s, they invested $5 billion in industrial robots with a Japanese company. However, they had such bad union contracts that meant that automating wasn't an option and everything required union approval. Workers that were laid off were even entitled to 90% of their pay. However, there's certainly more to it than just the unions.
But wait, there's more.
For example, engineers continued to design boxy cars, and there was little differentiation between GM brands, meaning customers got confused and also didn't want the cars that GM was designing. Actually, in 1980s, the cars they make were absolute lemons. Now, when foot traffic slowed in the dealerships, GM actually decided to come up with a bunch of incentives to make sure that people would be coming to the dealerships. However, when these incentives were gone, GM had actually trained their customer base to expect discounts, which is some of the worst things you can do as a business. And the final thing that definitely didn't help GM in the long run was the fact that they had terrible management, which came with terrible acquisitions. There's an incredible list of acquisitions that GM made or investments that they made that didn't work out. For example, they bought Opel and Vauxhall and they sold both for a loss. They bought Lotus and Saab and sold those companies too. They bought a 49% stake in Suzuki, but they had nothing to say. And they also bought and sold EDS, Huge Electronics, AC Delco, Delphi, Allison Transmission and GMAC. They also entered the Indian market and made a silent exit. The real trouble and the real bankruptcy for GM started in 2005, which is the point where sales slowed down and GM couldn't cut costs. The reason why they couldn't cut costs was because of their bad union contracts, and they had so many fixed costs that even laying off workers wasn't going to help. They lost $9 billion in the first quarter of 2009, and because of the financial crisis, banks didn't really want to give them a credit of a few $1 billion. Now in June 2009, GM eventually filed for bankruptcy, and it was bailed out by the US government for $15 billion, and in turn the US government gained a stake of 2/3 of the ownership, and this released GM from their bad union contracts, which means they could actually try and make a return. Now, however, this also meant that they had to get rid of some of their other brands, which meant the death of Oldsmobile, Pontiac and Saturn. Now, under new management, GM did come back as the #1 automaker, and these days their market share is 16.3%, which is of course far less than the more than 50% they had in the 1950s. However, the question is if GM is going to be able to compete this time around. There's definitely some interesting challenges in the future, such as self-driving technology and electrification. And companies like Nissan with the Nissan Leaf and Volkswagen with the Volkswagen ID.4 have EVs, and they plan to release a lot more. And then there's of course always going to be Tesla, which is very strong on electrification and is leading the way when it comes to self-driving technology. Now, of course, GM had the Volt and they have the Bolt, which sell quite well, and they plan on selling 400,000 EVs and want to have 20 EV models by 2025. But the question is if it will be enough and if they will be able to gain market share in a world where the Asian and European companies are once again catching up to them.
Everyone agrees the clock is ticking for Detroit, and the casualties are already mounting.